Okay, Bismillah. Welcome back, everyone. It has been a week or so since our last get together, and today we're going to be moving on to week two of our critical thinking course, in whatever this ends up being. And so our focus for this week is arguments, specifically the validity, the soundness, and the anatomy of reasoning that comes from arguments. We'll get into what this actually means in a moment. I wanted to just start off by asking us a really big question. Why should a Muslim of all people care about critical thinking? And we looked at this last week, and part of the answer that we found together was that it's already within our tradition of Islam. That the Quran has, according to certain exegesis, 30 something words for thinking in general, the faculty of cognition, the ability to think. And our scholars have built entire sciences on the analysis of an argument. Within some schools, we call this the faculty of logic. Our So critical thinking was never a foreign import we brought to the religion. Rather, it was something that we already had, but due to circumstances of colonialism and everything else that has impacted modern day Muslims, it's something that we've half forgotten. And so that's the why. Why critical thinking is important. In a nutshell, in a tightly packaged present, that is why critical thinking is important. But this week is the how. How do you critically think? And when I say critically thinky, this is only a foundational structure to how you approach critical thinking. It is not the be all end all, and it's not to be the most comprehensive form of understanding critical thinking. Rather, it is simply an explanation for the basics that can get you on the right track and that will push you to do your own learning and your own studying in understanding critical thinking. And for full clarity, before we start, uh, this is probably the least exciting content we're going to go through. There will be no dramatic debates, no famous philosophers, no spiritual arguments. Today it's just a workshop on the tools, the essential tools we need for our bench. And we'll learn how to use each of these tools properly and individually and then together. But I do want to clarify at the very start what we learn here, if you truly master this single piece of content, everything that comes later from studying Al Ghazali and what he says about the philosopher, to Hume and his explanation of miracles, to modern day atheists, and in the Enlightenment period, to whatever YouTube podcasts we hear that sounds so clever and really push an idea and identity, all of it, every single piece of literature trying to prove something or tell you something, will be built upon what we're going to learn for the next hour or so. So really focus up and pause if you have to, take some time if you have to, but we'll get through this content, inshallah. So let's get into it. First of all, we're going to go through our roadmap here, and I'm going through this so that you know exactly what's coming forward. First, the parts of uh, what an argument is actually made of. When you take the lid off, I'm going to teach you how to lay an argument out flat. I call this the anatomy of an argument. And then the two big tests for an argument, and they're called validity and soundness. We will then roll our sleeves up and hopefully go through an actual argument that I've mentioned. And I do want to quickly touch on validity. The way I like to describe it when I first learnt it, it was like when I first approached someone in courtship for marriage. You will really struggle to feel like you've understood it properly until you've understood it. And so it's one of those ones where you're just gonna have to stick with it until it sticks. And it will stick. It will definitely eventually stick, but you might just need different exposure or just really struggle with it until it sticks. But we'll get through it together, inshallah. We'll be going through deduction versus induction as well, a very important point on critical thinking and arguments, reconstructing an argument that I've found in the wild, why this matters for a Muslim. Of course, we have to contextualize it all the time, and then some readings I've recommended, and then some extra readings that aren't necessarily about arguments, but I do think are important for a Muslim to hold on to. So, moving on to where we left off for last week, simply put, the main thing that we learned was that assertions are not arguments. It was that this single distinction, the difference between someone asserting something and someone arguing for it. And to give an example, the one that we gave last week, an assertion is simply saying it. Islam is rational. That's a claim thrown onto the table, but an argument says Islam is rational because, and this then gives you the reason. And it's important to note the language there, the word because that language changes everything within what we're trying to say. It's the door opening from an opinion into something that we're trying to reason and understand with. And on this point, let me ask you something. What are the little words in our language that tell you an argument is happening? Going back to Year 10, Year 11, Year 12, high school, what are the key terms that we are told to point out? A few that come to mind immediately. Because, since, therefore, so, it follows that, given that. All of these words or short phrases are language that show that something is trying to be argued, something is trying to be reasoned with, something is trying to be proven. And at the end of the day, it comes down to your English literature skills. You have to be able to read something and say, okay, I've read this word, so it's trying to tell me something now. Let's see what they're trying to say. They're the seams of an argument, is the way I like to put it. And the reason I say seams is just like on my jacket. If we undid the stitching seams, you would see exactly the makeout of how this jacket was made. And so, in the same sense, if you undo the seams of an argument, you see exactly what they're trying to say. And I did say last week that we'll start applying the framework to real text, academic and religious. Hopefully today we do tackle that. We'll move swiftly on though to what I call the engine room. And this is because that name actually matters quite a bit to how I'm going to explain what we're about to do. Think about a beautiful car, really sleek, gorgeous, the kind of thing that when you see it down the road, everyone's head turns. Now, the paint doesn't move the car. The leather seats within it don't move the car. What moves the car is a greasy, complicated, some call it ugly, some call it beautiful, engine that hardly anybody will take a photo of and post online. That engine is doing all the real work, while everything pretty just sits on top of it and turns everyone's heads. And the reason I'm getting us to create this visual in our head is because arguments are exactly like this. Everything you'll ever read, a tafsir, a philosophy paper, a viral thread online, a debate that gets hundreds of millions of views, underneath all of it is an engine. Our role here is to identify what is that engine. The premise is pushing towards a conclusion. That's the machine. Everything else is just beautiful phrasing and eloquent voice and a confident self and an emotional story. That's all the paint job and the nice tires and the rims and the leather seats, and that's all a paint job. We have to look at what is truly being said. And here's the uncomfortable truth that people don't like to sit with. Beautiful writing is very cheap. Anyone can learn to write beautifully. In fact, with the age of AI, you can teach AI to write beautifully. There are people who write like angels and who speak as though they're born with an innate ability to get everyone in the room to listen, but they reason like children. If you can only see the paint, if you can only see the glory of the item, you will be fooled by it your entire life. And this is hitting to the heart of why critical thinking is so important for a Muslim. But if you can see the engine, the core of what is being said, you can pop the hood and look at the actual machine underneath and never be dazzled by the shiny surface again. I do want to caveat though, like, you can still be dazzled. It's important that you still take that step back anyway. And so that's the type of superpower I'm trying to give us here, that we have X-ray vision, and hopefully I'm gonna teach you how to turn it on. So the central question: what is the difference between an argument that feels convincing and one that actually is convincing? And why is telling these two apart the single most important skill you can develop from this entire series? Think about it for a second. Feels convincing is about us, about you and me, about your mood, your tiredness, whether the person is flattering you or they're already telling you about something you already believe in, whether they were charming. Is convincing is about the argument itself, its structure and its facts. Nothing to do with you at all. So here's the thing. A con man, for example, will live entirely in the world of the first, something that feels convincing. A scholar is trained to live in the second, the world of is convincing. Today is the first day of that secondary training of what is convincing. And by the end of this hour, you'll have a precise, usable tool and not a vague feeling. But it's important to note, you have to learn how to make something feel convincing and be convincing at the same time, especially when you're in public forums. And we'll get to that later in the course or in the series, but just something to keep at the back of your mind. So the anatomy of an argument. Let's open up this machine that I had us think about earlier and name the parts to it. And there are only three. One of them is invisible, and this is part of what fools people. And we'll go through all three, and then I'll explain a little bit in more detail. So the first thing we have is the premise, then the inference, and then the conclusion. So a premise is a reason you're being offered. It's a starting point, and usually it's something you're asked to accept so we can build on it. And some language you'll notice that was the terms that we mentioned earlier: because, since, given that, so, it is, therefore. Part two of an argument is the inference. And the inference is the leap from the premise to the conclusion. It's what moves a reason, it's what moves an idea from reason to being an actual claim. Think of it like a bridge, and it's invisible because nobody ever actually says it out loud unless they need to, and they just walk across it and hope that everyone else follows along. And part three is the conclusion. That's the destination, and it's what the whole argument is trying to get you to believe. Let me give you an example I gave children at work the other day, and I like to try and make it the simplest possible picture. An argument is a bridge. On one side of the river is stuff you already believe. That is the premise. And on the other side is somewhere new the person who's giving you the argument wants you to go to. That is the conclusion. The inference is that actual bridge connecting one side of the river to the other. And a bridge can fail in two ways. Either the ground you started on was soft, meaning the premises that were built upon were false, or the bridge itself was broken, meaning the inference didn't hold. So imagine that in your mind, right? You're on one side, and that's your premises and what you already have, and the ground is soft, so the bridge doesn't hold. Or your ground is firm, so the premises are firm, and as you're crossing the bridge, it breaks. That's the inference that you're developing, not really connecting. And so we'll name all of this properly soon, but it's important to try and understand in abstract ways, because what we're talking about is very abstract, and it's hard to pinpoint it exactly. So if these visuals help, then leave a comment to let me know. And if they don't, I'll try it different ways. Now, to point out, this anatomy of an argument and the idea of premise, inference, conclusion, and everything I just explained is not new to our tradition. When a scholar of usul al-fiqh, for example, does qiyas, analogical reasoning, you look at the structure. There's the asal, the original case with a known ruling. There's the far, the new case that you're reasoning about. There's the illa, the underlying cause that links them. And out comes the hukum, the ruling. If you'll notice, it's very similar to the idea of the river and the bridge that I had you think about. This is a fully structured argument. There's a premise, an inference, and a conclusion, worked out with enormous care over 1,000 years. And from this, we understand that an argument and the anatomy I'm giving you is found very clearly within our religion, within the fatwa of the sheikhs, within the books of the great imams of the different madhabs. It's found everywhere. And in the Western tradition, the same skeleton shows up as syllogism or syllogism. I don't know how to properly say. I say syllogism, which, if I remember correctly, comes down from Aristotle. Aristotle is one of the really big names we're going to talk about later on. And funnily enough, about Aristotle, the Western world would not have his research and his writings if it were not for Muslim philosophers who preserved them and sharpened them. In fact, if you go back to Europe at the time of its Enlightenment or after its Dark Ages, basically everything they read about Aristotle and Plato came from Muslim scholars. And you might see Averroes, for example, as a very famous name who commentated and explained Aristotle and Plato's works. And the idea I'm trying to push here is that the Western world was built upon the backs of Muslims and they've just rebranded it, but that's a whole different discussion. So whether you're in a madrasa or a modern philosophical department or just scrolling online, the anatomy will always be the same. That there's your premise, your inference, and then it leads you to the conclusion. And a practical tip that I like to do that sometimes saves me time is find the conclusion first. Especially when you're trying to be very critical about something, don't read top to bottom like a story. Ask, what is this person ultimately trying to really get me to believe? Find that, and then everything else will unroll itself. It's kind of like when you have roll of sushi, you take out the rice or the seaweed. Actually, I don't know. But you get that. You take something out and the rest of it unrolls. It's the same thing here. So, on premises, and I've titled this Premises Hide because arguments in the wild almost never lay themselves out politely to you the way that we're going to be talking about them here. The reality is that premises hide, they duck, especially weak premises. They really, really try and hide and bury it. Sometimes the conclusion comes out first and the premise trails after. Sometimes a premise is completely unspoken. They don't make any mention of any premises and they just assume. And you're supposed to nod along without noticing anything. In fact, we see a lot of this nowadays. That unspoken kind of premise has a name. We call it an enthymeme. Enthymeme. Yeah, it should be Enthymmeme. As I've got it here, enthymeme. I don't know how to pronounce it, to be honest. I've actually not heard anyone say it in a long time. I'll have to go back to my lectures. But it's important that we point it out because I want you to remember it. Because it's where manipulation within the media, within books, within knowledge occurs at this basis. So let me show you. Someone says, of course he'll betray you. He's a politician. Sounds like a complete thought, right? It isn't. There's a hidden premise there doing all the work and it never gets said out loud. The hidden premise is that all politicians betray. The moment you drag that into light and say it plainly, and if this was a discussion, of course he'll betray you. He's a politician. So you're telling me every single politician who has ever lived betrays people, all of them? Do you notice how now the whole argument gets weak and wobbly? And it was only strong when the premise, that underlying idea that all politicians betray people, was hidden. Something to think about, right? And this is the single most powerful move in all of critical thinking. Pulling the hidden premise that isn't mentioned out into the open air. People smuggle their most questionable assumptions in as things that everyone just knows. Never stated, never defended. Because the second they're stated, they're shaky. And now I want to plant a phrase that I want you carrying out of this room and into your life. It's something that Sheikh Bahdan taught me, and it's something I very much live by. Verify before you amplify. As Muslims, we should be people speaking truth. And the basis of speaking truth, especially online, is this single statement: verify before you amplify. And as I learned it from Sheikh, it's also within our Quran. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells in Surah Al-Hujurat, O you who believe, if a corrupt person comes to you with news, verify it. Check it. Before you accept a claim and pass it on, verify it. And the whole tabayun principle of when there was the tragedy of the slander, a'udhu billah, when the community of Rasul repeated something they had not checked, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells them in Surah An-Nur, they spoke with their tongues that of which they had no knowledge, and they thought it was a light matter, a weightless matter, while with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala it was tremendous. And tying it back to what I was trying to teach you, a hidden unverified premise is exactly this. Oftentimes, it's a claim nobody checked, and it's being passed along and being built upon, and it's doing damage and damage, while everyone treats it as a light matter. I saw, because of the World Cup recently, a Aussie posted online on Facebook, don't ever go Egypt because you can't play on the Egyptian soccer team if you're not Muslim. And we were laughing at this in our group chats, but it had over 10,000 likes on Facebook, and it got me really thinking. No one verified this, but they're running with it. And look at the damage it's causing. It's painting a Islamic nation in a certain way. And our Deen has told us 1400 years ago, verify before you amplify. And I'm just highlighting this message that my Sheikh has passed down to me, and I'm passing down to all of you. Because, and the reality is, as technical as we can get and as educational and academic as we can get, critical thinking in its large part is just obedience to that command, but with better tools. That you're verifying something and then you're either amplifying it or trying to shut it down. So hold that phrase to heart. We'll come back to it every single time. And specifically today, when we talk about soundness, that's when we'll really settle into verify before you amplify. So the standard form. Now I'm going to teach you the actual physical skill of this week, putting an argument into standard form. This is the thing that if you master it, it carries you through the whole rest of this course. And the standard form I've made dead simple. You list each premise on its own numbered line. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 9, 10. Or just 1, 2, 3, or just 1, or 1, or 2, 1, 2, 3. However many premises you identify, write it down clearly. And you draw a line underneath, and then you write the conclusion with the word therefore in front of it. That's it. It's as simple as that. So I'll explain it one more time. You have an argument in front of you. You list each of its premises, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You draw a line, and then you write the conclusion. Before you write the conclusion, you write therefore, and then you write the conclusion. That's it. Think of it like the instructions for Lego. Instead of someone waving the hand and saying, yeah, build this and build a bit of that and watch a YouTube video, you go to the instructions and you say, okay, step 1, you put these 2 bricks together, and then step 2, you put that brick, and then step 3, this brick. Every step out, and then you keep doing that until you get a finished result, and then every step, you look at it and you take a step back and you see it slowly being built and then built and then built. So let's do an example now. to help us understand what the standard form is. Someone says, "You should bring an umbrella. It's going to rain and getting soaked is miserable." So to put this into a standard form, the premise is 1, it's going to rain. 2, if it rains and you have no umbrella, you'll get soaked. And 3, getting soaked is miserable, something to be avoided, therefore you should bring an umbrella. Now notice something. Premise 2, if it rains and you have no umbrella, you'll get soaked. The person never actually said that out loud. It's not mentioned in that statement at all. I had to add it. It was hidden. And you might be like, "Oh, Abdullah 80k, that's cheating." No, that's me being very fair, reconstructing what was clearly inferred, clearly meant, filling in the obvious meaning so to link the argument and keep it as strong as they intend it to be. That's me being honest about this. And you'll find that sometimes it's hard to be honest about that. And this is a motor skill that you have to learn and train. It's like riding a bike or learning to pray with proper khushu'. You cannot get it just from watching it. You have to do it yourself over and over. And you'll start off clumsy, and just like when riding a bike, you'll fall over. But the more you do it, the better you'll get at it, until laying an argument out flat becomes as automatic as tying your shoes, and it just becomes super simple. But especially when you're trying to be honest with the argument, it does get really difficult when it's something personal or emotional or something that really gets at you. So why the standard form is power? Why bother laying out everything like this instead of just arguing off the top of your head? That's a common thing asked to me, especially when I teach people about debating. And the reason I give is 4. The standard form gives you 4 powers that you wouldn't have had before. The first is that you can see exactly how many premises are actually holding the argument up. That means you can then spot the missing premise the person was hoping you'd skip right over. Or you can test the inference they're trying to make between the premises and the conclusion cleanly without the pretty writing and the way it's explained getting into your eyes. And best of all, you can aim. Because when you're in an argument, the one who has better aim and can shoot down the other person's argument is the winner. And so instead of aiming at the whole argument, you aim at that single weak premise and you put your finger to it and you dig, because the deeper you dig into that premise, the more the whole argument will fall apart. And this connects to something we touched last week, which I care about more than more than this whole course, to be honest. Because it's such a common thing thrown around, especially when you go out and do da'wah, the straw man versus the steel man. And we'll get into this a little bit later in more detail, but a straw man is where you take the weakest, dumbest version of what someone has said and knock that down, and then you act like you won. It's cowardly, it's just sick, but it's dressed up as being clever. And a steel man is the opposite. You build the strongest, most charitable, most honest and greatest version of the argument, even stronger than they made it, and that's when you engage with it. And the reason I say to do this is because when you do this extra work and this extra honesty, and we'll talk about how our scholars of the past have done it later on in the course, but when you do it like this and create a steel man version of their argument, you are really making your rebuttal, your response, testing their argument in the best way possible by deconstructing its best version. Because what would you rather do? Deconstruct a very weak, poor version, or deconstruct the best version so that they can never then come back to you? It's like if you had the opportunity for a debut fight to fight someone who's miserly and weak and disabled, and then fight someone who was the absolute best. But if you win, you prove yourself then as the absolute best, you'll always take that absolute best. And the standard form is the tool that lets you steel man their arguments. Because when you lay someone's argument out cleanly, and you might even charitably add a missing premise that they haven't said, two beautiful things end up happening. The first is that you end up understanding their position most of the time better than they understand it themselves. When you watch the Muslim Lantern debate Christians and atheists online, he will often do this, lay out their arguments better than they understand it themselves, and they will then start questioning him, not on Islam, but about their own arguments. And second, if you still defeat it after steelmanning and after laying it out, your victory, your intellectual victory, actually means something a lot greater than you realize, because you beat the real thing and not a puppet or a dressed up version of it. And this isn't just a technique, as I said, it's a matter of adab, it's a matter of conduct. This is how the giants of our religion argued, and not to get too much into it, but a little bit of name dropping. Ibn Taymiyyah rahimahullah ta'ala went after the philosophers. He stated that when he would go after them in his different kitabs, he would state their positions with absolute fairness and such precision that oftentimes it was mistaken that he was amongst them. And this was then before he viciously tore them apart. And so this rigor in our tradition, it's a courtesy given because it's a form of respect, but it's also conveniently how you win the Western academic world, the Western seminar room. When you're trying to make an argument or when you're in a debating scene and you steelman the opponent, in the Western world, that is amazing because they're like, he's gone an extra step to understand our arguments and then destroyed it still. It works both Islamically and in the West, and it's why I think it's such an important part that is missing from a lot of people nowadays. So, validity. Oh man, validity is a hard one, and I'm gonna have to pull up my notes here. Okay, validity. We arrive at probably the part that I'm going to struggle the most to explain it. And it's the reason for this is because it's an idea that breaks people's brains a lot of the first times that they hear about it. So, deep breath and let's do it together. Validity in an argument is about form and not truth. And yeah, we'll run with that. It's about form and not truth. So don't confuse the two here. An argument is valid when its structure is such that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. It would be forced to be true. There would be no way to accept the premise and still deny the conclusion. That is a valid argument. Now, this is the part that trips up everyone. Validity says absolutely nothing about whether premises are actually true. And it's why I can say it's a form and not truth. Because if the form of the argument can be valid, but the premises are not valid, it can still be valid, but not true. And that might just confuse us a little bit more. So let me try and paint this in the simplest possible picture I can. Think of a vending machine, right? You beep, beep, bop, bop, and then you get your water. And if the machine is working and someone's properly loaded it, water comes out. That's a good machine. Now, what if someone loaded the water slots in there with poison? Beep, beep, bop, bop, you press the buttons, and the machine, working perfectly, delivers you the poison. The machine is not broken. In fact, you would say the machine did its job flawlessly. The problem was what got put in and not how the machine worked. And this is what I mean by validity. Validity is the machine working properly. It guarantees that whatever truth you put in, the right thing comes out at the other end. It does not and it cannot guarantee that you put truth in. That's a totally different question, and it's what's coming next, inshallah. And in our tradition, this is the siha, the correctness of the form of a qiyas. Separate from whether its inputs are true, the mutakallimun distinguish the burhan, the demonstration itself, from the matter it was reasoning about. And if you go in detail into the books of fiqh and how they do their qiyas and come to why X and Y is equivalent to A and B, they knew precisely that a proof can be perfectly structured and still start from a false and incorrect premise. And this isn't a modern day discovery either. Western academia just calls it validity. And it's the first thing they'll teach you if you do Harvard's H1003 on logic, if you do any Oxford study on logic, any anthropology study on logic, any language study on logic. This is the basic that they teach. So you're learning what our scholars teach and what the Western world teaches about validity and logic. And hopefully, with that, I've explained why validity is a form, but not equivalent to the truth. Valid and false. So let me hit you with the example that makes it click in my mind. And it's deliberately ridiculous because the more ridiculous something is, the more ridiculously well it sticks. The first premise, all cats are immortal. Yeah? Undying and whatever. Premise 2, Socrates is a cat. Therefore, because of premise 1, that all cats are immortal, Socrates is immortal. Now, is this a good argument? Watch how you want to say no. But hold on. Look at only the shape of the argument. If all cats really were immortal, and if Socrates really were a cat, would he have to be immortal? Yes or no? Yes, he absolutely would. There's no wriggle room. This conclusion, therefore, is forced. So this argument is valid. The form is flawless. It is also complete nonsense because the premises, the base of the argument itself, are lies. Cats are not immortal, and Socrates, whichever one you mean, because there is so many, was not a cat. The Socrates I'm referring to being the Greek philosopher. This is the whole lesson in one silly example. Validity is a guarantee of transmission, that the argument is being transmitted in a valid manner, not a transmission of truth. Like a pipe, a good pipe carries whatever you pour into it. You pour clean water into the pipe, clean water comes out. You pour poison into the pipe, poison comes out, but the pipe itself is not at fault. The pipe is a perfectly good pipe. It's done its one job. Validity guarantees the pipe, says nothing about the water going in and out of the pipe. And so this water, in the context of the pipe, is our next idea, soundness. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Because there are rules to validity. An argument is valid when, if the premises are true, it is impossible for the conclusion to be false. So let's walk through what that lets happen and what it forbids. Because there are 4 combinations, and I've listed them out here. I was going to make a matrix square, but I could not figure out how to do that on Obsidian. By the way, I'm using Obsidian. It's where I put all my notes and my ideas and my thoughts. And yeah, I love the Zettelkasten system. So true premises create true conclusions. That is possible. Fine, that's the normal good case. I was going to give an example, but we'll get into examples. A false premise, but a true conclusion. Possible. Believe it or not, it's allowed. You can stumble into a true conclusion from false premises through a valid form. Oftentimes, we might say it's lucky, or that your deduction, your inference is amazing that you're able to do that. It does happen, so it is possible. A false premise and a false conclusion. Also allowed, also possible. That's where I used our idea of the immortal cats and therefore immortal Socrates. It's a false premise, but if the premises are true, it forces a false conclusion. So it's possible. And then the fourth, true premises and false conclusions. This one, in a valid argument, is impossible. It can never ever happen. The single impossibility is the entire definition of validity sitting in one line, and it gives you a weapon. If you ever find an argument where the premises are clearly true and yet the conclusion is clearly false, you have already proven it invalid. Because no matter how slick it sounds and no matter how confident the speaker is, you've caught the machine breaking its own rules. And the reason for this is if the premises were true, but the conclusion was false, that means he hasn't properly understood the premise. So from now on, whenever you meet an argument, you're going to ask two questions in this order. First, is the form valid? Does the conclusion actually follow? And only then, after you've said that the conclusion follows the premises it was built upon, the truth of the premises, its soundness, is questioned. And if that doesn't make sense, please leave a comment below and we'll go through it together in a little bit more detail, or I can link a few places where you can read, because there are much greater thinkers out there who've explained it. So, soundness. If validity was the pipe, let's talk about the water going through the pipe. An argument is sound when two things are both true. One, the argument itself is valid, what we were just talking about, and two, its premises are actually, in the real tangible world we live in, true. And here's the cutoff line. Only sound arguments actually establish anything. Validity alone gets your working pipe and everyone can then make arguments with who knows what flowing through it. Soundness gets your working pipe with clean water in it. And that's the real prize as Muslims, because we want truth. When someone hands you a genuinely sound argument, you are then obligated, and as I was talking about earlier, steel man, to rationally accept their conclusion. There's no honest way out of it. And this right here is the home of the phrase I planted in our brains earlier. Verify before you amplify. Look at what soundness demands. It demands that you check the premises, not that they just feel true, but they are true. And you verify that. And this is where the Islamic tradition outshines everyone, because we built an entire science within the religion about this. The Isnad system, subhanAllah. I could go on and on about how beautiful the science of hadith is. But when a hadith comes to us, we do not just accept it because it sounds pious or because it feels right. We check the chain. Every single narrator in that chain, we examine. We examine how their memory was, their honesty, their character, whether they could have actually met the person who they claim to have heard it from. It's a whole discipline that goes into such detail. The science of men in the chain, and it's built to verify the premises before the conclusion is accepted. I'm contextualizing that within our actual argument. The science is a lot more broader than that. But it does the very thing we're talking about here. Verifies before it amplifies. And yeah, subhanAllah, it is such a beautiful thing. And so before the conclusion is accepted, you have to verify the premises. And the premises in the case of the hadith are each and every scholar who narrated the hadith and how valid of a narrator they were. And so when you report a broken chain, it becomes worthless because you can't verify the premises of the hadith, no matter how fruitful and righteous it may sound. This is, within the structure of an argument, soundness. That is, you verify before you amplify. And this is that phrase turned to a civilization scale science of the religion. And the command sits right there in the Quran as well. As we said earlier, فَتَبَيَّنُوا in the ayat. Verify before you accept and before you pass it on. And in a world of information where the second you've said something, someone can just Google it to see if it's true, and AI might feed them the right information or the wrong. In a world of forwards and retweets and screenshots, and where a lie is halfway around the world before the truth has even been written down on the screen, this ayat is more practical than it has ever been. Do not amplify what you have not verified. A believer who shares an unchecked claim, is not being clever or quick. They're violating both an explicit command of the Quran and they're poisoning the pipe. So soundness is not some dry Western logical term. It's a religious item as well, with the very same ideas. Verify and then amplify. And then, only then, accept, and spread the conclusion. So hopefully soundness was much simpler to understand than validity. We're now going to talk about ways to kill an argument. But I will pause quickly because it's about Maghrib time. I will go pray my salah and then I will be back shortly. What's up everyone, I'm back. For you it's a moment, but for me it's been several hours, so give me a moment to quickly get my bearings on where we are for for the continuation of today's lecture. So, 2 ways to kill an argument. What I'm about to give you is probably the most practical tool other than verify before amplify. And this is, how do I even argue back? When something is said to me, how do I fight back? How do I give resistance that reflects truly everything we've talked about and changes a vague panicky feeling into a simple checklist that we can run through rather, in real time, in conversation on the spot. Any argument at all, can be defeated in exactly one of 2 ways. And at the end of the day, this is a very deductive way of looking at it, but it is also kind of hard to prove false. The first way is that you show the form of the argument is invalid. Show that even if we grant them the premises that they're making, the conclusion still doesn't follow through. The inference they're making, the bridge connecting the 2 sides of the rivers, is broken. It is non-existent. Or, the second way, is to show that the premises are false, that its form might be perfect, but because one of the starting points of the argument is untrue, the whole thing fails to prove its conclusion. And in the term of 2 rivers, in the river and the 2 different sides of it, there's one side being all muddy that the bridge can't even hold. And that's the whole game. Either you have the broken bridge or the soft ground. Every rebuttal in the entire history of human thought is one of these 2 moves. And of course it will be dressed up and explained in a lot more nuance, but at the end of the day it does come down to these 2 things. When Al-Ghazali demolished the philosophers, he was doing one of these 2. When Hume attacked miracles and the concept of religious miracles, he was attacking one of these 2. When you argue with your cousin at dinner, it's one of these 2. Run through this checklist. Is the form valid? If no, then attack the leap. If yes, are all the premises true? If no, attack the premises. And if the form is valid and every premise is true, then let's be honest and concede, because the argument is sound and you've lost. And losing to the truth is never a defeat. At the end of the day, a loss to pure truth that we're saying is form because the premises are true and the form is valid, in some way you can even say this is guidance, religious guidance maybe. So deduction versus induction, maybe you've heard me say this a little bit, and this one has the most Islamic parallels to it within this whole discussion. I know I've made parallels earlier, but this is the one where the parallels are most clear, most obvious, and most followed through. So fundamentally, there are 2 different kinds of reasoning that a human being can do. And there's a whole discussion on whether we're born with this ability, and I tend to agree that we are innately born with this ability. We'll get to that discussion later though. And these are, coming back to the analogy of the car, the machine painted up, these are the 2 different engines. And they give you 2 totally different views on how things happen. And as I said, the first is deduction, the second is induction. So going through deduction is airtight but modest. If the premises are true, the conclusion is guaranteed 100%, no gaps. That is essentially what deduction is. But, and this but is important, the catch is deduction never actually tells you something new. It only unpacks or reveals what's already hidden within the premise. Deduction is like when you unpack your suitcase, you already packed yourself. Nothing comes out that you haven't already put in. All bachelors are unmarried. Tim is a bachelor. Therefore, Tim is unmarried. Did you learn anything new? No, because we know that all bachelors are unmarried and we know that Tim is a bachelor. You just unfolded what was already there within those statements. Cold by me for doing that on the dot. The second is induction. Induction is, compared to deduction, induction is very ambitious and risky. So induction leaps beyond the evidence. You've seen, there's a classic example actually. You've seen 1,000 white swans. So you conclude all swans are white. That gives you real new knowledge about the world, which deduction never did. Because you've seen 1,000 white swans, you are now concluding that every single swan is white. However, this can be overturned by the very next observation. You see a single black swan and you're finished. Your understanding, gone. And if I was to simplify it further, induction is opening a few boxes, seeing its inside, and then guessing what's in all of the boxes you haven't opened yet. Useful, and it's oftentimes necessary, but it's never certain. And here's the parallel that we should be paying attention to. Our scholars within the religion, they mapped this out with extraordinary care. And they did this well before Western philosophy was doing it. In our tradition, knowledge comes in two grades. There is knowledge that is yaqeen, with certainty, and there is zan, probability, or preponderant, depending on what source you're looking at. And evidence is qati', decisive and certain, or it is zani, probable. Probable. And you know this from the hadith. A report comes through mass transmission. This type of hadith is then called a mutawatir, because there are so many independent chains that they all could not have conspired to lie. This gives you yaqeen, certainty. A report through a single chain though, which is ahad, however sound, it gives you zan, like a strong probability, it's said, because while it might be reported as sound, it is only a single hadith or a single chain. And so you have strong probability, it's been said, but not absolute certainty. And of course, that would change if it was a sahih hadith. We're saying that's a sound hadith, maybe a hasan. And this is exactly the deduction. This is exactly the deduction and induction distinction. Yaqeen is what deduction delivers. Zan is what induction delivers. Our usul scholars even had the word istiqra for induction itself. They were living inside this idea while building Islamic law. And a classic mistake that ruins people's reasoning is dressing up an inductive argument as if it's a deductive certainty, claiming yaqeen when you only earn zan. And an example of this would be, it's always worked before, so it's certain to work now. A lot of us actually, I know on Hope Core on TikTok, you see it so often. It's always worked before, so it'll work out now for sure. No. Induction never gives you certainty. That is the bottom line. Or, and watch this one closely, because it will. There's a portion to I'm dedicating later in the course. Every miracle report I've ever checked turned out false. Therefore, all miracles are false. That's an inductive leap. It's a strong one. In fact, it's the exact argument Hume makes to go against miracles and fight against the church. He dresses up the idea of probability as certainty. And spotting this is already half of the reply that the intellectuals have for him. I'm not going to resolve that reply now or get into his philosophy. That's something that we'll reserve later on once we've gone through a lot more of the basics. I'm just planting the seed that Even in these high level academic scholarly discussions, this is how they function. And so the simple rule to carry out here is match your confidence to the method that you use. Deduction earns certainty. Induction earns a degree of confidence, but always drop one level down on where you think you should be. Because a humble and accurate thinker knows what they're holding and what they're trying to find, or where they're trying to go, rather. So let's do a construction of this in the wild. That's how I phrase it, at least. Because we have our tools now, induction, deduction, the anatomy of an argument, and everything else we've gone through, let's go through a raw passage, steelman it, see what type of argument they're making, and see what we can figure out from this. And we'll do something that people argue about at 2 a.m., me included. Here's the raw passage, the way we'd actually hear it. Look, the universe is unbelievably fine-tuned. Nudge the physical constraints by a hair and no life is possible anywhere, ever. And things that exquisitely tune towards an outcome don't just tune themselves. So obviously something tuned it or tuned it. This is, of course, a discussion you'll also see a lot if you go out to debate and discuss on religion, the necessity of God. And it's kind of why I've included it here to equip us with these discussions. But one crucial warning, and I'll say it loud in a second, we're about to reconstruct this argument. Reconstructing something is not agreeing with it. Watch what I do, and watch that I never once tell you whether I think the conclusion is true. And we'll start with that. Step 1, find the conclusion. What's the destination in this statement? Something tuned the universe. That is what I would say is the conclusion. That is where we're being taken. And the final statement says it quite well. So something tuned it. So the conclusion here can be something tuned the universe. Step 2, pull out the premises, as said earlier. And then step 3, supply the hidden one. The way we practice, let's lay it all flat. So the first premise I would point out is the constants of the universe are fine-tuned for life, said in the very first statement. Premise 2, fine-tuning toward an outcome does not happen by itself. That's why he says that something must have tuned it. Premise 3, and this one was the hidden one, whatever does not happen by itself has something that caused it. And I'll repeat that again, because it's not clearly said there, but you infer this to make the conclusion, to make the inference from the premises to the conclusion. Premise 3, and the hidden one, the one that builds the bridge, whatever does not happen by itself has something that causes it. And in this context, we call it the tuner, the thing that tuned it. Now look at what just happened. A minute ago, this was a vibe, a feeling, a thing that either grabbed at you or annoyed you, depending on what you already believed. But now it's like the car we pictured at the very start. It's a machine on the table where every part is exposed. And now, only now, we can run our 2 questions cleanly. Is it valid? If we grant those 3 premises, does the conclusion follow? Roughly, yes. The form is decent and the bridge, I would say it holds somewhat. Now, is it sound? Are these premises actually true? And that right there is the real fight, and it's what theologians will talk about forever. Premise 2 and that hidden premise 3 are exactly where an atheist would push back and fight, and where a serious theist would dig in, because that's the crux. That's where the real disagreement lies. And notice what we have not done here. We have not decided whether God exists. We haven't preached, nor have we debunked. All we've done was locate, with precision, maybe even surgical precision, the exact spot where the real argument is. This is what I'm trying to train our brains to do. find the crux instead of two people shouting past each other or at each other for an hour. We'll come back to arguments in this family properly in phase two, and that'll be maybe 10 or 12 weeks from now. Today was just to show you the tools we can use when we're in these discussions. So, moving on to the idea that the skill is neutral, because it's something that I was really trying to push in that worked example. Reconstructing an argument is not the same as agreeing with it. I need this one to land because some of you may have walked in here with a quiet worry, maybe from last week, maybe from before, the worry that these tools are secretly on the other team, that logic is a Trojan horse, that if you learn to think this way, you'll reason yourself out of religion, you'll reason yourself off the right path, off what you love to do. Let me put those worries to rest because it was very similar to the worries I had myself when I first really tried to start understanding critical thinking, critical theory, the human mind, cognition, metacognition. Logic is a scale, a balance, and a scale does not care what you weigh on it. You can weigh gold or you can weigh dirt, the scale will work the same. That is, we all can all agree on. When you have a scale, you put gold, you put dirt, no matter what you put, as long as they're the same weight, it will work. The atheist uses validity and soundness. The believer uses validity and soundness. The exact same tools in both hands. The tools themselves have no theology in them at all. The only question, the only one, is who has trained themselves better in using them. And of course, I understand this comes from a Western paradigm, but the reality is I'm talking to a Western audience. And even in a non-Western paradigm, this is still evident. And it comes back to who has trained harder or better or is more educated in using them. And for most of Islamic history, the answer was us, the Muslims. They wielded these tools at a level that most of the people attacking Islam online today could never survive a single round with. The tragedy is not that the tools belong to the other side or that they belong to us or that they belong to someone else. That's not what's important here. The tragedy is that we stopped using these tools, that we're scared of these tools. I'm creating this so that the sharpest person in the room, inshallah, is you. And so this ties directly, actually perfectly into why this matters for a Muslim. Let's bring it all together now. The single most valuable habit this entire week instills is the ability to hold apart two questions that almost everybody puts together. Question 1, is the reasoning good? Question 2, are the starting points true? Watch what that does to you when a critic comes at Islam. Whether it's in the lecture hall at uni, whether it's in the comment sections on a post, whether it's in your own head at 3 a.m. when you're really questioning, why am I here? Is it worth still being here? You won't have that vague or sick or concerned or lost feeling anymore. Instead, you can get to ask it coldly and precisely and deliberately. Is their logic actually broken? Or are they just starting from a false premise, a false idea? And 9 times out of 10, I can promise you, in fact, I'm so confident, I want to say 10 out of 10 times, I promise you, they come from a false premise first. And now you can say exactly which premise and exactly why, and we can go in on this discussion but we'll park that bus, and instead, when someone comes at you or the religion or whatever you're arguing about, you won't just have a feeling about, oh, I know I should respond. You'll be able to name it and respond accurately. And it's this reasoning that allows us to stay tied to reality and tied to revelation and discipline and grounded. And the Islamic tradition draws a careful line between this reasoning and the reasoning of the disbelievers and of the deviant sects. It's important to remember here that in the first lecture, we do the callback to what the Quran tells us, that the ability for cognition and reasoning and thinking was something that was praised, that we're told constantly, will you not reason and will you not reflect within the ayat of the Quran and the creation of God over and over? But it never praises the arrogance that reason can lead you to. It never praises the one who starts reasoning that I am greater, that I do not belong, that I do not need God. It never praises reason that goes too far. And it's important that I draw this distinction now, because sometimes we can then start inductively or deductively reasoning that I am superior than this person, I am greater than this person, I have this ability and they do not, I am better. This is incorrect, and I want to stop it before it happens, and may God protect us from being overcome by this evil. Reason within what is right, and do not reason with what is wrong, you know? I don't know how better to say it. Um, at the end of the day, we all need our Lord, and that no discipline and no detachment and no education and no knowledge will make us not need our Lord. So don't ever cross that boundary, is what I'm trying to say. And another thing I want to highlight is that rigor is native to our tradition and not borrowed. And I want to close this whole part by putting a fear or an idea to death entirely. Some of you might still feel somewhere in you that logic, the idea of logic, the idea of critical thinking is a foreign country, that in learning this, you're stepping outside the tradition that we've been protecting and praising, and you're putting on the clothes of someone else. So I'm speaking to you if this is you. You are not leaving the tradition, you are coming home to it. And I'll give you a single detail because it's such a beautiful one and it helps to prove my point as well. Al-Ghazali, one of the greatest minds our Ummah has ever produced, loved logic so much and defended it so fiercely that he wrote a book about reasoning, and he called it Al-Qistas Al-Mustaqim. I'm 100% sure I've just butchered that, but the just balance and the straight scale. And he took that name, that translated name that I've translated, straight from the Quran. That the balance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us to weigh with. He argued that correct reasoning itself is one of the scales Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to use. Think about that. He didn't see logic as a foreign tool that was grudgingly imported by Plato and Aristotle and the church and whatever else he was battling with. He saw it as a part of the religion, the balance that revelation itself points us towards. He also wrote another book, The Standard of Knowledge, laying the whole thing out for students, exactly like you and me. So this vocabulary I'm teaching on validity, on soundness, on induction, all of this might be new to you, yes, but within the practice, within the tradition, within academia, it is ancient and it's yours. You're not adopting a foreign tool. You're reclaiming what was within it already, that honestly may have been reformed and packaged in a way that was villainized and that was seen as evil, and that, oh, you're Ahlul Kalam. You were not. Ibn Taymiyyah, rahimahullah ta'ala, he engaged with it so robustly. How can we then comment and use his works if we don't even know the same tools he was using himself? This whole course is just handing it back to you. And that's why I really want to get through that the rigor we're using is native and not borrowed. So 3 things to leave with before we finish off. 1, validity is form, not truth. An argument can have a flawless shape and be completely and entirely false. And again, I'll use the immortal cat's example. Never confuse a well-built machine with a machine that's been fed the truth. Number 2, soundness is valid plus true. Only sound arguments could actually prove anything. Philosophically, this becomes a whole discussion on what can you truly prove and what can you truly believe in. As Muslims, we take from what is easy, the source that comes straight from God, and take away the simple line, just this one line: verify before you amplify. 3. There are only two ways to defeat any argument ever. Either you break the bridge, or you show that the ground the bridge is built on is soft, invalid form of argument, or a false premise. That is the whole checklist you will ever need, and now it's entirely yours. And before you leave, let's actually use it. I'm going to throw one argument at you, and I want you to shout back or write back or think back. Is it valid? Is it sound? And which premise would you go after? In fact, actually, I'm going to leave in the comments so that you guys have to engage. And that the last things I want to get through is that this week's work is a motor skill, because I did my best to try and find some readings on logic and these ideas of reason, but no matter how much you read on it and how much you hear what people have to say, once you've understood the basics, the only way you can get fluency is to practice it, is to identify. It's kind of like learning to write nicer. You can read all the books on the correct biomechanics and how to hold a pen and what is the best pen nib if you start using a fountain pen. The reality is you will only get better with handwriting if you write more. And it's the same with these motor skills. You will only get better with the anatomy of an argument and inductive and deductive reasoning if you start applying it. And so I can give you prescribed readings, and in fact, I'll leave them on screen for you to see. I'm not going to include them in the conclusion or in the discussion in the comment section, whatever goes below a video. I instead want you to open your newspapers and read what is said there. Go on Substack, read what articles are there. Even Twitter has articles now. Go and read what's being posted there and see if you can break down the arguments. Go on social media, do not engage with them. I don't encourage the engagement with them, but go and see what disbelievers or non-believers or people who call to violence are saying, and break down their arguments. Break down what Pauline Hanson is saying and see how what she says holds no premise, and it's why it seems so ridiculous to a lot of us. But you've never actually been able to name why what she said seems ridiculous. So it's a motor skill, and it lives in the hands and not the head, figuratively speaking, of course. And the one who actually sits down and does everything we're talking about next week, when we go into a bit more nuanced of an item, will be the person who has a lot better understanding and power. And so I have thought of a couple of discussion questions up here. So I'll leave them here. I'm not going to go through them. They're just ideas. But I do hope that maybe you can use them as a starting point. Otherwise, we've almost clocked an hour and a half. Thank you for letting me yap. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you guys next week, inshallah ta'ala. And I'd like to finish off with the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from the Quran, from Surah Zumar. Those who listen to speech and follow the best of it, those are the ones that Allah has guided, and those are the people of understanding. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us amongst the people of understanding, the people of guidance. May He make us amongst the those on the right path, on Sirat al-Mustaqim, and may He make us amongst those who receive the book in our right hand on the Day of Judgment. Praise be to God, most gracious, most merciful. Jazakumullah khair. I'll see you all next week. Do the exercises. Practice them. Thank you.